I was Taylor Swift's sound engineer, and the final mix we finished just before midnight still haunts me. I never thought a deadline could change everything, but it did. What started as a normal night in the studio became something much darker. That final track wasn't just music, it was a curse. And that midnight deadline? It sealed our fate. I was there when it happened, and now I can't escape what we unleashed. It was supposed to be the opportunity of a lifetime. Getting hired to work with Taylor Swift on her latest album was a dream come true. I had been a sound engineer for years, but this was different. I walked into the studio on that first day, surrounded by all the state-of-the-art equipment, the glowing monitors, and the hum of the room. Everything felt perfect, but at the same time, I could sense something off about it, something unnerving. We were told up front that the album needed to be ready by midnight. But that's not what made the whole thing strange. It was the way Taylor's team reacted when they said it. The urgency in their eyes. The way they moved like they were in a rush. Why midnight? I thought. It's just a time. Just a deadline. But no one would explain why it had to be done at that exact hour. The night before the final mix was due, I was in the studio alone, tweaking the track. I thought it would be a simple task, just a few minor adjustments. But as I sat there, listening to the music through my headphones, I started feeling this weird pressure building. The mix wasn't right. It didn't sound wrong, exactly. It sounded too right. Every beat, every note was perfect, like it had been crafted by something other than human hands. And yet, something felt wrong. Like we were missing something. The crew was scheduled to come in later, but I couldn't shake that feeling. I knew Taylor was going to demand perfection, and she always did. But something about her perfectionism this time felt desperate. It wasn't just about making the song sound good. It was about something else. I could tell. Then came the cryptic comment from one of the engineers, a guy who'd been working with Taylor for years. He pulled me aside before the rest of the crew arrived and said, "Just make sure it's perfect by midnight. Trust me on this one." He didn't explain further, but the look on his face was enough. It was like he knew something terrifying. And when I asked him what he meant, he just shook his head and muttered, "You'll see soon enough." I couldn't ignore it anymore. The tension in the room was real. As the clock started ticking closer to midnight, the urgency was palpable. Everyone was working faster, harder, as if they were racing against something far worse than just a deadline. I caught Taylor staring at the clock several times, her face tight with focus. Every time the hands of the clock moved, she looked more and more intense. By 11:45 p.m., I was already starting to feel the weight of it all. I had finished the mix and was preparing to play it back for the final time before sending it off. Taylor stood by the soundboard, silent, watching intently as if waiting for something to happen. The tension in the studio was almost suffocating. It was as if everything in the world depended on this one moment. When the final mix played through the speakers, I thought it sounded perfect. It was everything we had worked for, every detail meticulously adjusted. But then I noticed it, the sound. It wasn't just a track, it wasn't just music. It felt like something was alive in it. And as the clock hit midnight, I felt it. A shift in the air. Something that had been building up, something I couldn't put into words. It was over. And yet, The air was still thick, heavy, as though something had changed. The weight of it all hit me then. Whatever we had just finished, it was more than just a track. We had crossed the line, and there was no going back. But as the song finished, and everyone started to relax, something started to change, and that was just the beginning. The minute the clock hit midnight, it felt like everything changed. It wasn't just the music, it was the air, the weight in the room. The moment that was supposed to be a celebration of completing the track felt like something darker had settled in. I watched Taylor, her eyes still locked on the speakers, staring at the sound waves like they were something more than just sound. There was something distant in her gaze, something empty. And she wasn't the only one who seemed affected. As I stood there, feeling this strange pressure around me, I couldn't shake the sensation that we had opened something. There was a pulse to the room, like the track had bled into the walls themselves, the entire studio vibrating with energy. I thought maybe I was just exhausted, that the pressure of the deadline had finally gotten to me, but the rest of the crew seemed off too. They were all rushing around, acting as if their own lives depended on the next move, the next decision. When the song ended and everything fell silent, I glanced at the clock. It had barely been a minute past midnight, but the tension hadn't let up. Taylor stood up and paced, her voice cutting through the silence. "Is that it?" she asked, almost whispering it to herself. I nodded, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. "Yeah, that's it. Perfect. Just like you wanted." She didn't respond. She just looked at the track again, her eyes now wild, searching the sound. Her lips barely moved, but I could hear her muttering, as though speaking to the music itself. And then she stopped, dead still, as if something had snapped her out of a trance. "Something's wrong," she said softly, her voice almost unrecognizable. I froze. The air felt even thicker now, stifling. It wasn't just the anxiety in the room, or the pressure, or the strange way Taylor was acting. It was everything. The whispers in the track, the way the music didn't sound like it was coming from the speakers anymore. I glanced around, and the others, engineers, assistants, were acting just as bizarre. Everyone was distracted, eyes darting, heads swiveling like they were trying to listen for something. But there was nothing to hear. Nothing except that damn track. "Let's just play it one more time," I said, trying to push away the feeling of dread creeping in. "We're just tired. Everything sounds fine." But I could see it in Taylor's face. She wasn't hearing the same thing I was, and she definitely wasn't seeing the same thing. She had this look on her face, as if she had seen something on that track, something she couldn't understand, couldn't process. She walked over to the soundboard and leaned in close, turning up the volume. I winced, thinking about the neighbors next door, but something inside me felt more than just discomfort. It was an instinctive panic. I wanted to scream to stop her. I wanted to tear that track out of the system before it consumed us, but I didn't. Instead, I stood frozen as the mix blared through the speakers, the bass vibrating my chest. And then I heard it, the voices. I thought at first it was just the track playing tricks on me, but no, it was more than that. The whispers started low, barely audible, but growing. They were there, in the background of the track, creeping through the sound waves like shadows. I thought I was imagining it. Maybe it was the fatigue. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks. But then the whispers started to take shape. They were words that didn't belong there. They sounded like distorted voices, muffled and unintelligible, but I heard one word, clear as day: help. I looked at Taylor, who was staring at the soundboard, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaking. She didn't answer right away. She just kept listening, her eyes wide, locked on the speakers. "Play it again," she said, her voice hollow. I hesitated, but then I clicked the button, letting the track roll through again. It was louder this time. The whispers were unmistakable. Not just words, but pleas. The voices of people who had lived and died, their cries resonating through the song. It felt like they were trapped in the music, desperately reaching out from whatever world they were in. But they weren't just in the track. They were in the room. My heartbeat was pounding in my ears. My palms were slick with sweat. I looked around the studio and I swear, every single person in that room could feel it too. No one was saying a word. No one moved. It was like we were all frozen in place, listening to the chaos that had found its way into the music. "This isn't right," I whispered, backing away from the board. But Taylor, she was still listening. She was still searching for something. "Don't stop it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't stop it. We have to finish it." I looked at her. She wasn't herself. There was something else in her. Something that had changed. The track had taken hold of her, and I could feel it tightening around me too. The longer the track played, the stronger the pull. The music was changing. Us. The whispers kept growing louder. They were all I could hear now. A roar in the back of my head, too powerful to ignore. It was too late. I couldn't stop it anymore. We were trapped in this studio, bound by the very thing we had created. The track had come to life, and we were its prisoners. But the terror didn't stop there. Whatever we had unleashed was just beginning to grow. And soon, it would consume more than just the music. I thought I was going crazy. I couldn't be the only one hearing those whispers. They had to be real, but no one else was talking about them, and Taylor had gone eerily quiet after that last time we played the track. It felt like everyone was pretending it hadn't happened, pretending the voices hadn't crept through the mix. But I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't forget it. The track was alive. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that something had shifted in that room. It wasn't just the mix. It wasn't just the music. There was something older, something darker that had been awakened. It wasn't until the next day that I started to piece it all together. I was walking down the hall when I ran into Chris, one of the older engineers who had been working with Taylor for years. He had this way of looking at you, like he knew things you didn't want to hear. And that day, as I passed him, I could see the unease in his eyes. "You heard it, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low, barely above a whisper. I stopped, unsure whether to even respond. He didn't give me a chance to answer. "It's not just a mix. It's not just a song. There's something bigger than that," he said, glancing around like he was checking to see if anyone was listening. "And you just became part of it." I felt a chill run through me. What do you mean? He leaned in closer, his breath cold against my ear. You heard the voices. It's not an accident. Taylor, she's been doing this for years. You think it's just about making music, but it's about something else. Midnight? It's the time when the deal is sealed. The album isn't just a piece of pop music, it's a ritual. I backed away, trying to process his words. What kind of ritual? Chris gave me a sad, knowing look. The studio wasn't built just to make hits. It was built on land that's been cursed for decades. Every artist that works here unknowingly takes part in something darker. And Taylor? She's part of it too. That midnight deadline, it's not just about finishing the track. It's about binding it. And you've been pulled in. You can't walk away now. I felt sick to my stomach. A part of me wanted to laugh, to brush it off. But deep down, I knew I couldn't. There was something real happening here. Something dangerous. Chris walked away without another word, leaving me standing there, the weight of his words hanging over me. I needed answers, but I wasn't sure I was ready for what I would find. I spent the rest of the day going over the track, trying to make sense of everything. I played it back over and over, listening for anything that might explain what Chris had said. And that's when I noticed it. The track was different. It wasn't just the whispers. No, it was more than that. The tone had changed. The music wasn't just a collection of notes anymore. It felt like it was communicating with me. It was as though there were hidden layers, sounds buried so deep in the track that I couldn't even make sense of them. But I knew they were there, and they were growing. I started to question everything. Why had the team been so insistent on getting it done by midnight? Why had Taylor seemed so obsessed with that hour? It wasn't just about finishing an album, it was about something else. Something I didn't understand but could feel in my bones. I decided to dig deeper. I pulled up the history of the studio, looking for anything that could explain what Chris had said. And what I found? Well, it wasn't what I expected. The studio had been built decades ago, and it had a long history of being a place where things happened. Artists and musicians who had worked there over the years had all been affected in some way. There were rumors, whispers really, about strange occurrences, accidents, and projects that had gone terribly wrong. And yet, it had never been widely discussed. But I found one name that stood out. It was buried in an old interview from one of the studio's first engineers, a man who had worked on the studio's very first project. He mentioned that the original owner had always insisted on finishing recordings by midnight, claiming that it was the only way to create something truly special. He'd hinted at a tradition, but never explained further. Now, I knew exactly what he meant. It was part of the ritual. I couldn't believe it. The music wasn't just a product. It wasn't just about perfection. It was about power. It was about making a deal. And we had unknowingly signed our names in the dark. I ran into Taylor later that evening. She was by herself in the lounge, staring at the wall like she was lost in thought. I couldn't let it go. I had to ask her. "Taylor, what's going on with the deadline?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my heart was pounding. She didn't look up at first. Then her eyes slowly met mine, and for the first time, I saw it. The weight of what she had been carrying. "It's not just about the music, you know," she said softly. midnight deadline. It's the way it has to be. It's always been this way. She paused, looking down at the floor. My father told me about it when I was young. The power of perfection, of making things just right. She swallowed hard, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. I didn't want to believe it, but now I know. We're all part of it. That's when it hit me. We weren't just recording an album. We were making a deal. And the clock wasn't just ticking. It was counting down to something far darker than I ever imagined. But even as I started to understand the curse that had us in its grip, I had no idea how far-reaching this ritual would go, or how irreversible it was. The feeling of being watched never left me. It was like a cold hand on the back of my neck, always there, always waiting. I thought I could ignore it, that the paranoia would fade as the days went on, but it didn't. The whispers, those voices, they kept crawling through my thoughts. It was like they were embedded in the music itself, wrapped around the very sound waves. It was as if the track had become something more than just notes. It was a force, a presence. I tried to bury it. I told myself I was just stressed, that I had spent too many hours in the studio, that I needed rest. But every time I closed my eyes, I heard it. The voices. Low, distorted, but unmistakable. They were always there, lurking beneath the track, like something waiting to be uncovered. And then they started getting louder. It wasn't just the mix that felt wrong. It was the space around it. The studio itself seemed to be changing. There were moments when I would step into a room and the temperature would drop inexplicably. The lights flickered in a way that didn't make sense, as though the electricity was being pulled in a different direction. And then there were the strange sounds. The creaks of the floorboards, the hum of the speakers, the scraping noise I kept hearing from the back of the room. But every time I turned around, there was nothing there, just the feeling that something was watching me. I couldn't escape it. The sense of being trapped only deepened. And it wasn't just me. Taylor had changed too. She wasn't acting like herself. The focused intensity that had once been so charming was now unsettling. She became withdrawn, her eyes vacant, like she wasn't truly present. It was as though she was being consumed by the track itself. It wasn't until one evening, when the studio was empty except for me, that I realized just how deeply the track had taken hold. I was sitting at the soundboard, staring at the monitors. The track played on repeat, but I wasn't listening to it. I was listening for something else. I could feel the pressure mounting, like something was about to snap. I pressed play again, turning the volume up louder than I ever had before. The bass rumbled through the speakers, vibrating the very walls. And then, as I listened, I noticed it. The shift. The track had changed in ways I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the distortions or the whispers. It was as if the entire atmosphere in the room had warped. The music was pulling me, drawing me in. I wasn't imagining it. Something else was in the room with me. I stood up, my legs shaking, and walked toward the speakers. But as I got closer, the air grew colder, heavier. It felt like something was trying to push me away, something that didn't want me to come any closer. The whispers became clearer, louder, more urgent. And then I heard it. One voice, cutting through everything else. "Help me!" I froze. It wasn't part of the track. It wasn't a whisper. It was clear, desperate, a cry for help. I yanked the cables from the speakers, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound immediately stopped, but the air didn't feel any lighter. It still felt like something was there, like I wasn't alone. I scanned the room, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing. Just the cold silence. I ran my fingers through my hair, trying to steady myself. It had to be a trick of the mind. I'd been overworking. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of that studio before I lost my grip on reality. But something kept pulling me back. I went to the door, but before I could leave, I heard the softest click. Then another, and another. Slowly, I turned around. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hall outside. Footsteps that weren't mine. I stood frozen, waiting for someone to come through the door. But no one did. The footsteps continued, each one heavier than the last, as though something was pacing outside, waiting, watching. I don't know how long I stood there. My breath was shallow, my body rigid, every muscle tensed. But eventually, the footsteps stopped. The room was still. The sound was gone. I turned and bolted out of the studio, not caring about anything else, my legs carrying me as fast as they could go. When I reached the parking lot, I felt the weight lift off my chest. But as I sat in my car, my hands still shaking on the wheel, I realized something that chilled me to the bone. I wasn't escaping anything. The music was still inside me. I could hear it. Faint whispers that lingered in the back of my mind. It had followed me. It had taken root. And it wasn't just the track anymore. Something was in that studio with us. Something darker than I could comprehend. I needed to know what it was. I needed to understand how we had unleashed it and why. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I was afraid to know the truth, because once I did, there would be no going back. That night, I lay in bed, listening to the hum of the city outside. The track wasn't gone. The voices were still there. The force inside the studio had become a part of me, and I knew, without a doubt, that whatever we had unleashed wasn't going to let go. The deeper I dug, the more I uncovered. But the more I learned, the more I realized this wasn't just a haunting. It was something far worse. I couldn't keep running. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the whispers. They'd seep into my thoughts, clawing their way through the cracks, refusing to let go. The track wasn't just a song anymore. It was a force, a presence that had rooted itself in me, in everyone who had touched it. And the longer I stayed away from the studio, the more it felt like I was suffocating. It followed me, always in the background, always lurking. I tried to convince myself I was just overreacting, that everything would go back to normal if I just let time pass. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was building, something terrible. And as much as I wanted to ignore it, I knew deep down that I was running out of time. Taylor's behavior had gotten even stranger. She'd stopped responding to messages, stopped showing up for meetings. The studio had become like a ghost town, and I couldn't understand why. Every time I tried to reach out, the response was the same. Everything's fine. Don't worry. I'm just focused. But I didn't believe it. There was no just focused when people started disappearing. One night, I decided I had to go back to the studio. I needed to hear the track again. I needed to understand why it was still haunting me. If I couldn't face it, I would lose my mind. But when I arrived, the door was locked. It wasn't just locked, it was sealed. I tried calling the others, but no one picked up. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. I stood in the parking lot staring at the door, the darkness around me closing in. I didn't know why I was so drawn to the studio, but I felt like I had no choice. The whispers were louder now, like a constant hum in my ears telling me I had to go inside. But what awaited me inside? What had happened to everyone who had been there before? I didn't have time to answer that question. A few minutes later, the door creaked open, but it wasn't anyone I recognized. It was a figure, hidden in shadows, tall and unnervingly still. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They simply stepped aside, as if they were waiting for me. I hesitated but stepped in, the smell of dust and something metallic hitting me at once. The lights flickered on, revealing the studio, untouched but colder than I remembered. And there, at the soundboard, was Taylor. But she wasn't the same. She looked dead. Her eyes were wide but hollow. Her skin had a sickly sheen to it, as if she hadn't slept in days. She barely acknowledged me, her gaze fixed on the screen in front of her. "The track is almost perfect," she said, her voice distant, barely a whisper. But there was something in her tone, something wrong, like she was no longer speaking as herself. I stood frozen, unsure what to say. What was going on? Why had she been avoiding everyone? And why didn't she seem shocked to see me? "The track, it's not just a song anymore," she continued, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "It's more. It's a part of me, and I need to finish it. You need to help me finish it." I felt a wave of nausea hit me. It wasn't just her words. It was the way she said them, like she had become something other than herself. It was the track. It had done this to her. "I can't do this anymore, Taylor. This isn't right. You need to leave this behind," I said, stepping forward. My voice wavered, but I was done being silent. She didn't respond at first. She just sat there, her fingers moving slowly over the keys, almost mechanically. Finally, her head turned to face me, her eyes wide and empty. "You don't understand," she whispered. "You can't leave it. We're bound to it now." And that was when I realized she wasn't just talking about the music. She was talking about the curse. We were trapped by it. The track, the studio, the ritual. It had all been leading to this. And now, there was no way out. Before I could say anything else, the track played again, louder than ever. The whispers filled the room, echoing in my ears, each one more frantic than the last. The walls seemed to close in on me, the sound overwhelming, suffocating. I couldn't breathe. The track wasn't just music anymore. It was consuming everything. I ran to the soundboard, desperate to stop it, but as my hand reached for the controls, the lights flickered and went out. Darkness swallowed the room. The whispers stopped, and for a brief moment, I thought maybe it was over. But then, a voice, low and familiar, spoke from the shadows. "You're too late." I spun around, my heart in my throat. There, in the darkness, stood a figure. It wasn't Taylor anymore. It was someone else. Someone whose face I could barely make out. but I could see the outline of a twisted, empty smile. "You should never have touched it," the figure said. "Now it's a part of you." I stumbled back, my hands shaking, my head spinning. The force that had been building up around us, the dark presence in the studio, it was here, in the room with us. It had taken shape, it had manifested. The figure stepped forward, and I realized then what had been happening all along. We hadn't just made an album. We hadn't just created a song. We had made a pact that no one could undo. It was too late, and the track had won. But even as I realized what we had done, something even darker was waiting for us. Something that would spread far beyond the studio. I thought I had been prepared for what was happening, but I wasn't. The longer I stayed in the studio, the more the track felt like it was controlling me, pulling me deeper into its grasp. I tried to deny it at first, tried to convince myself that everything was just a series of coincidences, but there was nothing coincidental about it. The music wasn't just sound anymore, it was alive. Taylor had disappeared, not physically, but mentally. She wasn't the person I had once known. The track had taken her, and it wasn't finished with her yet. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening, whatever force was growing, had already seeped into me. I couldn't ignore it any longer. The whispers, the presence, it was inside me. And it was growing stronger every day. I had to understand what we had done. I needed answers. There had to be something, some truth buried deep in this nightmare that could explain why we were all trapped. So I went back to the beginning, back to the origins of the studio itself. The deeper I dug, the more I realized the studio was built on something ancient. It wasn't just a building. It wasn't just a place where music was made. It was a site of power, a place where pacts were made long before Taylor ever stepped foot in it. The midnight deadline was no coincidence. It was a ritual, and we had unknowingly walked into it. I found old documents, barely legible, but enough to piece together the history. The original owner of the studio had been involved in dark arts and ancient practices that used sound and music to tap into something beyond this world. That midnight deadline, it wasn't just to finish an album. It was to seal a deal, to summon and bind something to the music. And now, we had become a part of it. The track wasn't just a song. It wasn't a hit. It was the vessel, the means through which something had been awakened, something that needed to be fed. It wasn't just the studio. It wasn't just the music. It was us. Our fear, our energy, our obsession with perfection. That was the fuel. That's what made it stronger. I looked around the empty studio, the walls that had once felt so familiar, so safe. Now, they felt like they were closing in on me. The whispers were everywhere, not in the track, not just in my head, but in the very air. They were inside the studio now. They were inside me. I went back to the soundboard, my hands trembling. The track was still playing even though no one had touched it. It was louder now, more forceful, like it was trying to reach out. "Help me," the voice whispered again. This time, it was unmistakable. It wasn't the track. It wasn't a trick of the mind. It was a plea from something else, something far older than any of us. I couldn't escape. I couldn't run anymore. We had sealed the deal. We had become part of something bigger, something that would consume us all if we didn't finish it. But what would finishing it really mean? As I stood there, paralyzed by the realization, I knew There was no going back. The final piece was in place, but the horror of what that would mean was just beginning. I didn't know when it happened, whether it was that night or the next, or the moment the track played for the first time, but I had crossed a line. There was no going back. No matter how hard I tried to escape, the curse had latched onto me, woven into my soul. It wasn't just the track anymore. It was in my thoughts, my every waking moment. It was consuming me. I tried to leave the studio again. I thought if I physically removed myself, I could break free of whatever had taken root in me. But as soon as I stepped outside, it followed. I could hear the track, soft at first like a distant echo, but then louder and louder. I covered my ears, but it didn't stop. It was like the music was in the air, in the very fabric of the world around me. I went back to my apartment, hoping the distance would help, but it didn't. The whispers followed me there. The voices, so many voices, pleading, begging, and always growing louder. It was unbearable. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. It was like the track had seeped into the city itself, into every corner of my life. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, the music played. Every time I woke up, I felt it inside me. And I wasn't the only one. I knew Taylor had fallen under the same spell. She wasn't herself anymore. I hadn't heard from her in days, but I knew what had happened. The track had taken her completely. And the rest of the crew, they were gone too. People started quitting. Others disappeared without a trace. The music had infected all of us, and we were all spiraling. We couldn't escape it. We were all bound to it. Bound to the curse we had awakened with that last perfect mix. I tried to reach out to anyone who would listen. I contacted the team, the producers, anyone who might be able to help, but the responses were the same. Everything's fine. Don't worry, we'll handle it. No one believed me. No one realized the true horror we were facing. They were already too far gone. Like me. I went back to the studio again, desperate for answers. I needed to understand how to stop it, how to undo the deal we had made. But when I entered the building, it felt different. The air was thicker, the walls more oppressive. The track wasn't just playing anymore, it was waiting. I couldn't escape it. It wasn't just in the studio, it was in me. The whispers had taken root in my mind, in my very thoughts. I could hear them all the time now, louder, clearer. Not just whispers anymore, commands, demands. And that's when I realized something worse. The track wasn't finished, it was far from it. We weren't just part of it, we had become it. The track had been feeding off us, our fear, our desperation, our obsession with perfection. The voices, they were us. We had been marked by the curse, and there was no escaping it. Every moment, every second that passed, the music grew stronger, more powerful. It was like we were all just puppets, and the track was pulling the strings. I thought I could still fight it, still find a way out, but I knew now. There was no escape. We had become a part of something ancient, something terrifying, and once the track was complete, once the deadline had passed, there was no return. We were bound forever, bound to the music, bound to the curse. And now, as I stand here, feeling the weight of it all, I understand. There is no end. There is no escape. The track is everywhere, and we will never be free of it. the whispers will follow me, follow all of us until the very end. I thought I could escape it, that if I left, if I turned my back on it all, I'd be free. But the track, it's always there. It's inside me. It's in the air. It never stops. The whispers have become commands, a constant presence in my mind, pushing me, pulling me, reminding me of what I've become. The music doesn't just haunt the studio, it's everywhere. I hear it in my thoughts, in the silence, in the dark. The curse has no end. It's not something you can outrun. Taylor? She's gone. And the rest of the crew? They've vanished too. All of us are marked. We're all part of it now. The track is finished, but it's not over. It's only just begun. And as long as I breathe, the music will never stop. Neither will the whispers. We'll be trapped in it forever.